As I said, the big question in cognitive science is how brain and behavior relate to one another. And as I also already indicated, cognitive science has a number of different approaches that get at that question from slightly different vantage points. So, philosophy, computer science, cognitive psych, linguistics, and neuroscience. The central questions, if you want to formulate some, are very simple, but yet extremely complex in their answer. How do we perceive? How do we learn? How do we act? And in general, even how can we actually even study the mind? Because the mind, in some ways, is this abstract thing. And are there actual meaningful ways that we can get some sort of insight, some leverage in understanding how our minds actually work and how they're structured? That question and the way we approach it has, of course, changed pretty dramatically over the years. And as technology progresses, we have become more and more able to study that process of what the mind does from many different angles. So let's touch on each of those areas of cognitive science a little bit to give you some broader background. And let's start with philosophy because, of course, philosophers have pondered about how the mind works, how the brain and the body relate to one another. They have asked these questions for a very long time. We can go back to, for example, the famous Greek philosopher Plato, not to be confused with the stuff that your kids play with that gets stuck in your floors, but the philosopher Plato. And one of the interesting things that Plato came up with, he said many interesting things, but one of the most famous ideas that he has come up with is an story that's called the allegory of the cave. And here's how that story goes. The idea is that you can come up with the hypothetical scenario that we, as people, are actually prisoners who sit in chains with their backs against the wall, and all we ever see is some shadows in front of us. And those shadows are actually the result of people on top of that wall who are making movements, dancing, and so forth in front of a fire. So the fire creates light. That light causes those shadows to fall on that wall, and then we as people just see the shadows. This is an allegory in the sense that Plato thought of the way our senses perceive the world to just be some sort of approximation of reality, but not actually reality itself, because those prisoners wouldn't know that they're actually looking at some sort of representation of what's really happening instead of the actual real thing. The question Plato then asked is, how do those prisoners get out of this state of, getting this perception that's incorrect, and how do they actually come to understand the world for what it really is? And his notion was that people can do this by asking very deep questions, and by asking deep questions, he likened that in the analogy to prisoners breaking free of their chains, walking up this pathway to the top of the wall, and then being able to see what really was going on. And this was sort of how they could ascend to the sunlight. So, key in this idea is the notion of rationalism. Rationalism, if you think rational, right? Somebody being rational means they are using their thinking, they're being smart, they're reasoning through things. So rationalism is the idea that you can come to have a better understanding of the world purely by asking questions and by reasoning alone. An idea that Plato is also well known for is the idea of nativism. Nativism is the idea that we actually come to the world with innate ideas, some innate understanding, some predispositions, so that we weren't just completely clueless. Our system was already set up in order to learn certain things and act certain ways. The third thing that Plato used a lot is known as the Socratic method, which of course called after Socrates because he used this as well. And the Socratic method is the idea that you can come to know things by just asking each other questions back and forth. So this sounds slightly annoying, almost sounds like a 3-year-old going, well, why? Well, why? Well, why? But the idea is that by repeatedly asking each other questions and then forcing another person to answer, you can actually come to a deeper understanding. This process, however, is no guarantee that by the end of all the questioning, you have not just gotten to a point of something that you already knew in the first place, but The idea is that purely by questioning and by reasoning alone, people can come to have a better understanding of the world. And by doing so, just like this statue in Philadelphia, actually, they break free of their chains and they see this light and come to understand the world for what it really is. So that's the contribution of Plato in terms of how we think about the mind. Then we fast forward a whole bunch and go to a French philosopher by the name of René Descartes. René Descartes is famous not because of being on Hallmark cards, but because actually coming up with the saying, "I think, therefore I am." You probably have heard this. Descartes was an interesting character, and he actually was extremely talented in many different ways, not just as a philosopher, but also as a mathematician. So let me jump forward a slide for a second. One of the things that Descartes was very interested in was the Pythagorean theorem. And the beauty of that, if you remember this from math class at all, is that, if you have a triangle, if you know two sides, then you can always calculate the length of the third side, and the answer is always correct. It's physics. It's basically describing the world in very precise terms, and there you can always get the correct answer. What struck Descartes as a philosopher was that the mind does not seem to be that way. So, for example, if you look at these two pieces of a line, this one and this one, and if you flash these really quickly in front of a person's face and you ask them which one of those two is longer, which one in the middle part is longer, most people say the one that I'm showing you right now. In reality, if you line these two lines up with each other, it actually turns out that they're of identical length. In Descartes' time, there were several of these kinds of perceptual illusions that were starting to be discovered, and they actually raised some real problems for Descartes as a mathematician, because Descartes as a mathematician thought, well, if you know A and you know B, then you know C, and it's always exactly right. Perception appeared not to work that way. You show a line in some context, right? So here's the actual line, and this is the context. You show the exact same line in a different context, and now people perceive something differently. So how we perceive the world is not just a function of the physical input that we get from the environment. That's interesting for psychologists because this means that perception is actually kind of open to interpretation, and it's open to what our brain, our system does with it. You have to kind of understand that in order to know what people are actually perceiving at any given point in time. So, from Descartes' struggle with mathematical problems, with correct answers, and this loose thing called perception, he came up with the notion of dualism and thought, well, the mind and the body must be different entities. There's the physical, and then there's the part that actually transcends that. Okay? So, because of that, he started believing in this notion of mental representations. Just like Plato and the reflections on the wall, those shadows being representations of reality, Descartes actually thought that the way we think, our thoughts are actual reflections of reality. They're mental representations. They're not necessarily exactly identical to the physical reality outside of our brains. So he's known for that. And he also was somebody who ascribed to the idea of rationalism, that we can come to understand the world through reasoning alone. This makes sense for him as a mathematician because a lot of math was actually exactly done that way. So that's René Descartes. Then we jump forward a bunch more and we get to England, and John Locke, another famous philosopher, actually started to argue against this idea of nativism, the idea that people came to the world with these predispositions. He instead argued that people came to the world, as in Latin you would call, as a tabula rasa. Keep in mind, all of the knowledge in that time was actually laid down in Latin. Tabula rasa in English means blank slate, meaning you come to the world with no predispositions. Everything that babies develop is just because they're actually experiencing the world, they're experiencing sensations, they get all these perceptions in, And then as a result of that, we learn skills, we start moving and so forth. So everything is based on experience. John Locke was also different from Plato and Descartes because he did not actually really think that just rationalism alone was good enough of a method to really come to understand our experiences and our perceptions. Instead, what he adopted was the notion of empiricism. You may have heard this, being an empiricist, empiricism, the empirical method. The empirical method is obtaining understanding based on data, based on observations. So collecting data, and the way we do science, right? You just develop an experiment, then you collect data, and then you use the data to verify whether your hypotheses are accurate or not. That is the empirical method. That's different from reasoning because we're now actually using actual data points, collected data, in order to make some inferences about reality. Finally, John Locke thought that thinking was just some series of mental images, almost like we have a movie going on in our head, and these mental images kind of just follow up on each other, and that process of going through mental images, that's what John Locke thought was thinking. Another famous philosopher, George Berkeley, came along and said, hey, hang on a second, how is that actually possible? How can it be that if you think of abstract concepts, for example, something like freedom or justice or anything like that, how could you possibly think of those as an image? Right? Think of that for a second. If you had to think of an image that represents freedom, well, you may think of Statue of Liberty, or you may think of not being in chains, or you may think of the hammer of a judge in a courtroom. But the actual abstract idea of freedom is much broader than that, so you can't really capture that in an image. If you can't capture it in an image, then the question is, how could thinking then be a series of mental images? So Berkeley raised this as a concern. This gets us to the start of the field of psychology that of course builds on those philosophers, and I will discuss that next.